This morning's scripture is from Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 through 9 and 18 through 23. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there, while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of the wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. But as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. Holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God.
Our scripture today begins the third major teaching discourse in the Gospel of Matthew. And it also begins Jesus' change of style in his teaching. He begins to teach in parables. In verse 11, which we didn't include in our reading, actually I should say the lectionary didn't include in our reading today, Jesus gives us an explanation for this change when the disciples ask him why he is speaking to the crowds in parables. He says, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given." In other words, many of the people around Jesus have closed their ears and stopped listening to him. Some would rather be blind and deaf than see and hear that the kingdom has drawn near in Jesus. So starting in chapter 13, Jesus chooses to focus upon who will hear and those who do see, namely his own disciples. Notice that Jesus doesn't stop his public ministry and just stop speaking to people altogether. He just changes the focus of his instruction to his disciples. Preacher Tom Long describes parables this way. He says, "Parables are simply profound. That is, they are simple, but for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, they are also profound, opening up deep insights about the ways of God." Well, we're going to see if I can retell this parable today in a way that we have eyes to see and ears to hear. At the Community and Spiritual Formation Committee meeting last month, we discussed the idea of writing our own parables as part of a study on the parables. So I decided to take up the challenge, and so I'm going to tell you a couple of stories today. Let anyone with ears listen. Once upon a time, there was a man who loved his church. He lived in a community where many people knew each other. But the city was growing and changing too. His church was just the right size to him, not too big, not too small. He had been an active part of its life since he was a child, 55 years and counting. And now he served on the session, just as his father had done before him. This church, his church, was firmly planted in his heart. And the church was doing well. Except for midsummer, worship was always well attended. Are y'all looking around? The congregation had quite a bit of fun together. They were a playful bunch. And as the man noted, they were also very friendly. Whenever anybody walked through the doors of their sanctuary, people greeted them and warmly shook their hands. In the man's estimation, the church was as healthy as a church can be, being made up of humans and all. Life was good for this church. So one night at session, this man, an elder currently serving on the session, asked a question. Perhaps, he began, perhaps since things are going so well, we might need to start wondering about what is next for us. What else might God be calling us to do here, where we are planted, building on our strengths, or maybe even doing a whole new thing altogether? The other session members nodded their heads in affirmation of this idea. After all, the congregation knew of Jesus' call to go out to the world and to not get too settled. They knew that the church existed for the sake of the world and not for the sake of itself, and that God was always calling them into newness and growth. Plus, good things were happening in their church, and they wanted to let the rest of the community know about it. God had given them a sense of God's embrace and grace, and they felt called to proclaim it to the whole world. They also felt called to practice what they preached about justice and mercy. So indeed, what was next for them? How might they grow in discipleship and mission? The session members, as spiritual leaders of the congregation, deeply desired to respond faithfully to the myriad ways God had so blessed that church. But they also knew this kind of imagination and visioning would take a lot of time and energy and eventually money to bring anything to fruition. So naturally, being Presbyterian and all, they formed a committee. First, so they'd be better positioned for evangelism and mission, the committee decided that the church really needed to do a new mission study. Since our community is changing, let's find out who is out there and what they want in a church, someone suggested. The rest of the committee agreed that kind of research sounded like a really good idea. After all, it was a deficit budget year, plus it was in the middle of summer when pledges could fall behind a bit, so no one wanted to spend a lot of unbudgeted money on a program or a mission activity or additional staffing if those efforts were not going to be successful and reap tangible benefits sooner rather than later. Furthermore, anything they did was going to take a lot of people power and time, especially if they were going to go out into the community and neighborhood and try something new. And this church, like most churches, was not a fan of failing. If they could not do it well, they were not sure that they wanted to do it at all. Messing up can hurt your reputation. No one, the pastor, the session, the congregation wanted that. Anything they did indeed needed to be carefully thought out and planned. So with the idea of a mission study in mind, they plotted the church on a huge map and began looking at the demographic data of all of the neighborhoods that surrounded the community in which the church was planted. First, they looked south. "Hey," said one member of the committee, "why don't we just go down there and get into this town? They may not want to come all the way up here to church. We may not be their spiritual home, but I bet we could find a way to do God's work with them as partners. As part of the same family of God, I wonder what we could do to help share the burden." The session member who loved his church nodded his head enthusiastically. "That would be incredible." "Yeah," someone else responded, "you are right. I am sure that there is a lot to do down there. But do you really think that we're the ones to get involved? I mean, there are a lot of churches already planted there. I'm sure that they have everything under control." "Well, I get where you are coming from," another person chimed in. "I mean, don't take this the wrong way, but I think our efforts down there just might get wasted. We could spend a whole lot of time and energy in those towns only to have it trampled on and thrown away. It would be like throwing seed in a Safeway parking lot. Looking for a way to minister in that area just does not seem very frugal or practical. Let's keep looking." The session members' spirits started to sink a bit as they all studied the map a little more. Where could they get the best gospel bang for their buck? What made the most sense from a cost-benefit analysis? "Look here," one of the other leaders said. "Here is a neighborhood just a few minutes from here with apartments that have a lot of kids in them. That might be a good place to go and tell about our church. I bet those kids could use another safe place to play and experience God's love." "That is true," responded another. "But notice how transient that population is. They might really enjoy coming here, but I bet they wouldn't stay very long. The more I think about it, that neighborhood sure looks like a pretty unstable group of people. One afternoon in the bright sun, and I imagine that their enthusiasm and their roots would just wither away. We probably couldn't count on them to become active, pledging families in our church. Let's look elsewhere to plant our good news." By that point in the meeting, everyone was starting to get a bit discouraged. The session member who began the whole thing started to rub his head, noticing a new throbbing pain. Another one went to go and find more coffee. "Okay, well, let's look north and maybe a little west then," one of them decided. "Look at all of the new development that is springing up here. There are tons of new apartment buildings and condos and townhouses. This would be a good place to go and plant a new worshiping committee or something like a worshiping community or something like that. This would be a good place to sow God's proclamation of grace and justice for all people. Let's go here." But another spoke up. "It looks like a really promising area," she agreed. "But I bet most of those people don't go to church. They are probably young professional types. No kids, they're single, newly married. Instead of church on Sunday, I bet they are heading out for a hike or they are going to their local Starbucks to get a latte for the morning. That might not seem church may not seem very hip or relevant to their lives. It's just a very thorny issue because I'm sure it would take a lot of money and time and energy to spread the word about our church out there or to plant something new. Do we really want to make that kind of serious investment when we might see nothing in return?" By this point, all of the members of the committee had their heads in their hands. It had sounded like such a good idea at first. They had really felt excited about all of the possibilities for growth in discipleship and in mission. After all, they were a good congregation. Things were going well. They knew God called them out into new spaces, to move beyond their comfort zones, to be God's hands and feet for hope and mercy in a world that was bleeding for it. And yet, after studying their options, none of it seemed very practical. They didn't want to get out there, invest their time and money into something from which they were not guaranteed a good return. They did not want to try something new if it might fail. They needed to be practical. The congregation counted on their prudent, carefully measured, well thought out leadership. "Well," one finally said, shattering the silence, "I suppose we could just wait a while longer. Keep watching and thinking about our surrounding community until we feel better about stepping out." And all of them, except that session member who asked the question in the first place, agreed. So he just gave up. And they folded up their map, they saved the data in their notes, and promised themselves that they'd look at it again in a few years when they had more members or more staff or more time or a bigger and better budget. And they did live rather happily ever after. But the session member never asked a question again. And over time, he became less engaged, and the church was less planted in his heart. Story number 2. There was this farmer who had a whole bag of seeds to sow, and she wanted to do a good job and be a good steward of those seeds. So at first, she was very careful. She did not want to be wasteful. Well, as she began to scatter them, she noticed that a few seeds fell on the road, a well-traveled road at that. And then she saw some birds immediately come down to eat them and to fly away. And the farmer put down her bag and took a broom and swept the rest of the seeds off to the side of the road. She thought about collecting the extras, but who knows? Maybe those birds would take them where they needed to be. She picked up her bag again and started sowing again, carefully with measured and controlled throws. But sure enough, 10 minutes into it, she noticed that a bunch of seeds had landed in absolutely horrible soil. It was full of rocks and trash. She put down her bag and did her very best to toil that awful ground. The work was tedious and frustrating. After a few hours in the bright sun, down on her hands and knees, her fingertips bruised and bleeding from her effort, she gave up. Oh well, she thought, who knows? Maybe the little work I did will help those seeds that are lodged deeply down in there. The farmer picked up her bag again and started sowing, filling her hand full and just letting it go. She finally felt like she had a rhythm to her work. But just as she started to feel good about what she was doing, she noticed that she was throwing seed into a group of weeds. How had she missed that at first? She stopped and saw that nasty, thorny weeds were encircling her precious seeds, like they were just waiting for the small seedlings to pop up so that they could smother them, taking all of their sun and water. Once again, she got down on her hands and knees, and she surveyed the situation. But by this point in the day, she was tired. She was tired of being so careful and so measured with her sowing. She was tired of feeling so stressed out over whether or not the seeds were going to get good results. She was tired of having to worry about where the seeds landed. She looked at the weeds, shrugged her shoulders, and got back up. This time, she decided to throw caution to the wind, as well as her seeds. And she took the seeds and just started throwing them everywhere, all around her. She even turned a few circles, tossing and tossing and tossing. She started to laugh. It felt good to be playful with it. It was fun not always to be so careful and so measured and so cautious with her sewing. As a matter of fact, she decided to take some risks. She threw some near where she knew that the birds would gather them. After all, she figured birds need food too. She threw others down a small creek. Who knows where the water might take them? She threw a handful in the middle of the weeds and decided perhaps they would be hardy enough to survive. She just ran all around, throwing them, laughing, enjoying her work. For the first time all day, she was finally getting to act out of her deep core of generosity. And it was great. She was sowing those seeds as extravagantly as she could. God, she proclaimed, do with it as you will. And with that prayer, she emptied her bag and went inside to rest. And she definitely lived happily ever after. Postlude to story 1. 30 years later, that church is still doing okay. The members are comfortable and content. Things are still running smoothly. The congregation is aging, their numbers have dipped a bit, but that's just what happens when the community changes and the culture shifts and people move away or they pass away. They still run a deficit budget, but they should be able to make it for a few more years, hopefully. What more could God ask of them, they figured. They were surviving and they were doing their very careful best. Postlude to story number 2. 30 years later, the farmer's grandchildren are the ones sowing the seeds. They've turned it into a game. They run as fast as they can, dancing and laughing and twirling in circles, tossing out seeds the whole time. And you should see the place. Plants are everywhere, fruits and vegetables of all kinds. The farmer always had a tremendous harvest. She never could have imagined the results of her generous planting. She just gave up on making any logical sense out of it. Every year, she simply decided to act purely out of generosity and grace. She knew she had stopped acting like a careful or prudent investor long ago. But wow, who could argue with her results? It's like the Garden of Eden had just exploded on her land. Her property is breathtakingly beautiful with lush green foliage as far as the eye can see. Who knew such beauty, such a tremendous harvest could come from generous, extravagant sowing of gospel seeds? And she wondered with delight, what more might God be asking of her children, and of her grandchildren? What an exciting time. A real gift to be able to dream and wonder and listen about what was next. It was such a glorious way to live. Let anyone with ears to hear listen. Amen.